So I have a few things that I want to talk about this morning, and one of the main ones this morning is I want to talk about is how we can bear the burdens of others, and what that actually means, and how we can actually do that in our lives. We hear a lot about it, but we don't always look to how we can actually exemplify that in our lives, how we can show those things, and how we can take on those things that others carry as well. And we'll see some of what the words actually mean, and we'll see a little bit as to how we can carry them. So let's turn to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, beginning in verse 2. Again, Galatians 6, beginning in verse 2. And it reads, "Bear one another's burdens, and thus fulfill the law of Christ." So we see here that we are to bear, to take up, or to carry one another's burdens. And the burden here in the Greek, in this part here, is baros. And it is a weight, or something pressing down on us, and spiritually in this case. Something that's heavy that we carry. And here Paul tells us to carry these things that are pressing on our brothers and sisters. And in doing so, we will fulfill or complete the law of Christ. Now, if we continue to read a little bit further down in verse 5, we'll see a little bit different side of a burden. So verse 5 reads, "For each one shall bear his own load." So if you're just reading it at face value, which obviously the Bible is God's Word, and it's wonderful to read, and it's all His truth. But if we're reading it without looking at sometimes what the words mean, it can be a little confusing at times. Because here we see we're supposed to bear one another's burdens, and then here we're supposed to carry our own load. It can be a little confusing at times. But here, that load or burden in this case is a little bit different. Here Paul tells us that we shall bear, again, take up that cross, or take up or carry their own load or burden. This is fortion, and it is a burden which must be carried by the individual. It is something personal and therefore not transferable. It cannot be shifted to someone else. And this load or burden is our personal responsibility. So we see that we are to help one another with those things that are pressing so heavily on us that they distract us from following God's Word. They bring us away from following Him. Those are the things that we're able to help and to carry for one another. And we can think of it as if moving. We were just moving in the gym the other day, not too long ago, and doing some more moving. And I'm sure everyone has helped someone move at some point in our lives. Or if you're carrying something really heavy and then someone grabs the other end of it. Boy, you could probably carry it your own self. When someone else is helping you, it's exponentially easier. Kind of feel that commonality between each other. So we see that we are able to help one another in that regard. But then later on there in verse 5, we are to carry our own loads that have to be carried by us. And we'll also turn to Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 28. Again, Matthew 11, verses 28 and following. And it reads, "Come to me, all who are weary, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light." So there's a few things here that I want to look at. Namely, we see and this rest that He promises us is on the Piwowar. I'm a scholar here, so you'll have to forgive the pronunciations. Which is to give rest or to give intermission from labor, and by implication also to refresh. It's a rest that after a needed task is completed. And that being said, we can also and others to show that we will still work in heaven. So it's not saying that we're just going to be resting completely from anything and when that time comes, but it is a rest from the daily life that here on earth. It is a rest from the trials and tribulations. It's we can also think of it as coming home from a long, hard day at work and just laying down for a few minutes. You kind of have that time to reconvene with yourself, reconvene with those around you, your friends, loved ones. You have that time to just simply rest from a weary day. That's that rest that he promises there. And there's still other things that we're going to do, and there's more work to be done. We can look at other scriptures as well for that, but it's a rest from that weariness and the heavy loads that we carry. Then if we read on in verse 30, we also see that Christ tells us his yoke, or heavy burden, is easy, and his burden, again, that fortion, is a weight we must carry ourselves. That is light. So following Christ and doing his commandments should be a light load, but that's difficult at times for us to do, especially if we're not sharing and bearing one another's burdens. So we see that his yoke is easy. Again, that the yoke is, we can think of that as something that's heavy pressing on, like a yoke that oxen would wear. They're pulling together in the same, typically pulling like a plow or something like that. Two animals working together to do that. It's something that is heavy, and it's something that isn't necessarily easy to bear. And we see here that it is easy, that Christ is easy, and that load, again, that fortion, that weight, heavy pressing down on us, is light. And with Christ and following his commandments and things, it's not, he doesn't place that burden on us that crushes us each and every day, that crushes us to the point where we can't follow him. That's not that burden that he places on us. It's that burden of following him. And that's a different topic for another time. Following Christ is something that would probably take us a few lessons to get through. But we see here that it is something that we are to do, and it is something that isn't crushing for us. And also, if we know that we're to bear those burdens of one another, and we look at the Greek on that bear back in Galatians, it wasn't a suggestion that you are to bear one another's burdens. It's an imperative that we're doing that. It's not something that we necessarily get a choice to. We're commanded to do that. And we don't want to be like the lawyers in Luke 11:46, and we'll turn to there in just a second. Again, Luke 11 beginning in verse 46 there. We don't want to be like some of the people there. And it is important to note that it is good to look at others' examples to see things that we are to do, and a lot of times also in the Bible, things that we aren't supposed to do. It's not always a criticism of those that we look at to say, hey, let's be like this person, and not be like this person. There are examples there to show what we can, and the things that we would be beneficial for us and things that wouldn't be beneficial for us. So again, Luke 11 and beginning in verse 46 here. And it reads, "But he said, Woe to you lawyers as well, for you weigh men down with burdens hard to bear, while you yourselves will not even touch the burdens with one of your fingers." Now he continues to have some woes there for the Pharisees and for others there as well that, and we talked about this in other classes, other lessons, that they weren't necessarily fulfilling that law of Christ. They weren't really having God's best interest in mind when teaching and different things there. But they do serve as a really good example for us of things not to follow. So we see that they are weighing down others with those hard burdens to bear, while they aren't even willing to lift, or touch the burdens with a finger. Instead, let's have a sympathy and empathy for one another and be there for each other. And it's a little side story on this one here. Maybe a few weeks ago, I was having these terrible pains in my shoulders. First it was the right shoulder, and then it was the left shoulder, right, the day after. And man, I didn't know what it was. I didn't fall, I just couldn't figure out where it had come from, right? And I asked Maya, and she's like, well, you probably slept on it wrong. And I was like, well, that makes sense. So then, because it was the right shoulder, I slept on the left shoulder, and then the next day, my left shoulder was pain, right? Go figure. And the way that she had known what my pain was coming from was because she had gone through it a few months before. And she said, "Oh, do you remember when I had that?" And I was like, "No, actually, I don't remember that at all." So, we have to be there to sympathize with one another. We have to have that empathy to look at that pains that we go through, to look for those things and be like, how do you know what I'm going through? Because we probably went through it too, or something similar. But that pain is so much more, it's so much more and heavy for me to bear than it was for you. Well, not necessarily, it's just different. We don't always look to, if someone else is dealing with that same thing, they probably had a hard time with it. And it's up to us, and we're there to help, and we're there to bear one another's burdens, to take up and carry, to help them carry those things. And we know that we're to sympathize in things, and we can also read in Psalm 68:19 that God daily carries our load or bears our burdens, which I think is a great comfort for us that He's always there to do that as well. And then we'll turn to Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. Again, Hebrews 4 and verse 15. And it reads, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." And as we see here that we don't have a high priest, Christ, who can't sympathize with us in our pains, but rather the opposite. Christ came down to experience this earth in flesh. And He was tempted, we can read in other places, and we looked at some this morning, we can see, yet He overcame those. He overcame those with Scripture, as we can read, and with that strong determination to continue through those trials that we face. We know that they're not easy things that we go through. Some of them are easier than others, we know and we realize, but they do bear down on us. But if we are clinging to God's Word, if we're helping one another to bear those burdens, it can be a little bit easier. Or having that sympathy for one another, it's going to make us a little more prone to wanting to help one another as well. And we'll also turn to Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. Again, Hebrews 10, beginning in verse 32. And it reads, "But remember the former days, when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul." So we see here a few different things again. The Hebrew writer here shows us an example of having sympathy for each other and accepting joyfully property seizure. It's not always something that we can look at that the disciples and apostles of the first century there did go through some really difficult times. You can peek, for example, at Paul's life. It was no walk through the park. He had a lot of things that he faced. And he faced those things pretty well, if you look at it. To count all of those things as nothing when compared to the glory that we have laid up, and when compared to following God, those things do seem as inconveniences for us, or maybe they should seem like inconveniences. And all the while having that sympathy for one another and continuing to be there for one another. And if we continue to have patience, again, that's the long-suffering, macrothomia, and endurance in keeping his commandments, we can get what was promised. And the Greek word for sympathy we looked at earlier was sympatheo, which is to have a fellow feeling with, or to sympathize with, also to have compassion on. And always sympathizing with one another and having those fellow feelings. We know that there's nothing new under the sun. And if we have struggles, chances are, like we talked about earlier, someone else went through something very similar. And we could also turn to the story of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 30 through 37. So we'll turn there now. Again, Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 30. And I like that the Greek word there for sympathy, because it is to have that fellow feeling with. You know, it makes it a little more personal, that we are going through those things together, or we recognize that someone else went through those things. And then, after recognizing those things, we decide that we want to be there for them. We want to help them through those different things that they're facing. Again, Luke chapter 10, and beginning in verse 30 there. And it reads, Jesus replied and said, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him, and went off, leaving him half dead. And by chance a certain priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him, and then when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put them on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay. Which of these three, do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robbers? Oh, and also verse 37 here, and he said, the one who showed mercy toward him. And Jesus said to him, go and do the same. You know, we see here a really good example of the compassion and sympathy that we can have with one another. We really can see how we're able to, in this case, literally carry or take up those burdens or things that others face. You know, we can see 3 people here that came upon this man. I guess a few more if you count the robbers. But we see, first, we saw the priest there, and also the Levites, people who you would expect to help and to, not to pass by. And the least likely of which to stop and help was a Samaritan. And it wasn't, there was it's even more than just a rivalry between Samaritans and Jews. There was, we can look in other places that aren't coming to mind right now, but they wouldn't even drink out of the same cup. So it wasn't something that, we look disdainfully down on them, or they're a little bit less than we are, but it's not even recognizing that we would share anything with them. Yet this person who has these differences was able to get past those things, was able to decide that this person is in need of help. This is a person, and I am here, and I am sympathetic to his cause, and not only does he, just bandage up his wounds, give him maybe some food and water, clothing, things that he might be able to recover in a few days and be on his merry way, because we see that he's on a journey. He brings him, he loads him on his own beast. We can see that he's, even takes him to an inn, gives money with the promise of repayment. This is more than just a passing thing that we're to do for someone. This is more than just that, little things that we can do for one another to ease up our load maybe a smile, a hug, words of encouragement. It's a little bit more than that. It's a deep loving for one another, a deep carrying those burdens for one another. So this all leads to the question of how we can actually bear, or to take up, again, to carry the burdens, the things that weigh down on us so heavily, and how can we do those things? And this part can be as simple and easy as perhaps listening or lending a listening ear, and you'll be surprised at how much of an impact this specific one, especially with your spouses, with our close friends, family, all those things, if we're just there to listen. Someone has a lot on their mind, something that's really just bearing them down. It might not even be something that we think of that would be tearing at them. Oftentimes it's not something that we think is, oh, well, I know you're really struggling with this, so I'm going to help out this way. Or maybe you could listen to see what they're actually going through and help them that way. And obviously we do know the things that one another goes through, especially spouses and close friends and family. We should know what one another is struggling with in ways that we can help out. But listening can really help. And we can also pray and talk to God, because we know He cares for us, and we can also pray and talk to Him for others. We can pray and talk to Him for ourselves. We read earlier in Psalms that He's willing to carry those things daily for us. Not just one time when we asked months ago for Him to help us with this thing, or one time when we were baptized, or whatever happens to be. Daily, He's willing to do those things. And are we willing to do those things daily for one another? And James 4, in verse 8, tells us to draw near to Him, and He will draw near to us. And there's a lot of times that it's the little things that bog us down and to burden us. Now don't get me wrong, we have major burdens that each of us carries, and it seems like really that those little ones are the things that kind of tip us over the edge at times. It seems that we can kind of shoulder our own loads, those major things that we have to deal with, those things, those personal struggles that we go through.